Happy weekend, everybody. This is Kevin. You are listening to episode number 20 of the weekend edition of the podcast. Today, I'm going to talk about a little bit of calibration history. My name is Kevin Radzik. I've been involved in the field of calibration, measurement, and metrology for over 20 years. On the PT Guru podcast, we discuss these topics and more, like quality and equipment and how all this impacts your life. My intent here is to educate and inform, but most of all is to get you to think for yourself and not just blindly listen to the system. So I welcome you to the PT Guru podcast. All right, so welcome. Hope you're having a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for hanging out. This is the weekend edition of the podcast when we put this guy up on YouTube, Facebook, some other spots in video format, as well as doing her up on the normal podcasting platforms that you guys are all used to seeing on a pretty regular basis. iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify these days. That's kind of cool. Or you can ask your Alexa device just to play the PT Guru podcast, and she shall do so for you. So since this is kind of the weekend edition, we like to kick it off by just talking about what we talked about during the week. So that way you can get caught up. If you're interested, something sounds cool, you can go check it out on one of those platforms. Started out the week with the 100th edition of the daily podcast. Kind of a cool landmark there, hitting triple digits. Just kind of talked about what it is, where we started, where we're going, what it's all about. Then Tuesday, we did our kind of real life metrology mashup day, and we talked about metrology in sports, more specifically with the World Cup going on. We talked about soccer and how much stuff really goes into testing and the actual metrology and such that surrounds a soccer ball. Really a lot deeper subject than what you probably think it is. Wednesday was the 4th of July, so kind of took a day off. I'm a slacker, I know it. Then for Quality Toolkit Thursday, we talked about the 7 wastes when we look at Six Sigma. Also kind of mentioned the 8th waste. There's kind of 2 different models floating around these days. A lot of these numbered things like 5S also have grown over the years. For now, 5S also has a 6S. But 7 wastes, some things to look in your process, in your situation, to try to make things better. That's what it's all about. And then Friday, we did a little podcast called Back to Basics. Really just kind of some underlying stuff that really exists in calibration and, you know, at its most basic level that sometimes I just kind of skim over because I've been doing this for 20 years. And it's kind of second nature to me, but some of you folks, it might not be second nature to. So I put it in there and kind of talk about some things about, you know, the underlying concepts and kind of break them down in a really easy to swallow sort of way. So calibration history. What the heck is even calibration history? I suppose it's really the kind of a history of weights and measures more than anything else, and that standardization of weights and measures through the years. And there's a lot that's happened with this historically. Some cool kind of high points to hit on here. A lot more than I could put into any one podcast, in all honesty. Could probably make a whole mini series about this, but kind of some of the earliest stuff is when you look at the old saying, you know, it's worth its weight in gold. Well, that actually meant exactly that at a certain point in time. Things were traded, especially maybe pricier items might be weighed against gold, might be weighed against silver. Less expensive things might be weighed against copper or bronze using double pan balances to say, okay, this much gold gives me this much of this valuable thing. Like spices at times were often measured this way. Things of that sort of nature. The oldest actual standard measure that we know about is the Royal Egyptian cubit. Now, the cubit itself had been around for quite some time already, and it's just recognized as kind of this length from the tip of your elbow up to the tip of your middle finger. The Egyptian cubit was a little bit different. I think it cut off at the palm, but regardless, it's still a body part. Measuring things based on body parts kind of makes any measurement a bit imprecise because I happen to be a different size than you, and that's going to be a problem. Now, the Egyptians realized that this was going to be a problem. They were building pyramids that are incredibly precise for the time. And so dating back to around 2900 BC, we actually have a couple of artifacts that show variation of less than a quarter of an inch between the different artifacts, which over the overall length being right around 20 inches, I would say that's pretty good for about 4,000 years ago. That's actually pretty absolutely amazing for 4,000 years ago. And this was probably a really big key to their success in building the pyramids, was being able to have precision measurements in a time when that wasn't even a thing. The subsequent to the Egyptian empires, the Greek and Roman empires appear to have kind of their own systems of weights and measures, and had a pretty high level of standardization kind of built into these systems. But with the collapse of these empires, which spanned large areas, hence why they probably really needed to have these measurement standards of some sort, with the collapse of the empires, we kind of largely lost most of that stuff to the Dark Ages, which really saw the demise of those early beginnings of metrology. And it's unfortunate. The Dark Ages really kind of saw large fragmentations of society and trade, and so large numbers of local systems tended to evolve after this. Unfortunately for the time, they would evolve independently in various areas under various rulers. At that point, and when you think about it, a lot of these units were based on things like body parts, especially when we're talking length. Now you're going to have a system that's based on a foot. Well, whose foot? It's going to be your king or your lord or your whatever's foot, or arm for the yard, or whatever. So all these kingdoms' measurements kind of got really fractured, separated, and just fell kind of by the wayside, and having things now be extremely arbitrary as opposed to being based on a central agreed upon thing. I guess when you think about it, it's probably inherent in the system that when you have things based on body parts, for instance, somebody's going to want it to be their body part, and somebody else is going to want it to be theirs, and it's going to turn into a big old fighting match. But these arbitrary measurements really came to a head in England in the 13th century with something called the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta, if you're not familiar with the document, is basically a power struggle between the King of England, the Pope, and then various other folks of power at the time, basically trying to limit the king's power and try to actually do some other important things. The Magna Carta really is an early document that really granted individuals some very important human sort of rights, like trial by jury, the inability to buy your way out of jail, the idea of no taxation without representation. Again, really important stuff that came out of this document. But for our purposes, we're the measurement folks, what we're looking at here is Clause 35 of the Magna Carta. Clause 35 of the Magna Carta demands standard weights and measures for grain, wine, beer, and cloth. 1215. England in 1215 was an economically buoyant land. New towns, new markets proliferated, driven by the continental demand for English wool. The English wool was of the best quality, and the folks on kind of the mainland of Europe were buying it up right and left. So for trade to really flourish, commercial confidence was obviously a big issue. You need to have people knowing that this is how much they're going to get. So to secure this, buyer and seller had to have a way to work according to universally agreed measurements. It's an intriguing fact of all the principles enunciated in the Magna Carta, besides those concerning justice and due process, it is that idea of the weights and measured be fixed that was most eagerly adopted in the constitution of newly fledged colonies of North America. After 1776, the same principle reappeared in the Constitution of the United States. Once again, what we find here is concern for the general public good, not merely the selfish interest of one particular country, class, or constituency. Interesting thoughts there. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, the right of the federal government to have power over weights and measures was an important part of the development of this fledgling nation. Interesting to think about that the framers of the Constitution built that in there to grant that. Now, something that's really interesting that happened here as well, unbeknownst to most folks, good old Thomas Jefferson actually put forward two proposals for a system of measurements in the United States. Now, the first being based on traditional means, and it's obviously what we kind of have to this day, with our feet, inches, and pounds, ounce systems. However, what he actually put forth was the idea that a foot would actually be 10 inches instead of 12 like we have now, and a pound would be made up of 10 ounces. If this sounds kind of familiar to you, the thing is, the metric system had already been bantered about. People started proposing it back in the 1660s-ish. And Thomas Jefferson was a very well-educated person and was kind of in the know with these things that were going on, and liked the idea of a decimal-based system where the math becomes a lot easier than these 12 inches in a foot, 16 ounces in a pound. But obviously, folks then, much like today, were used to the older system. They were used to the system that was in play and pretty much laughed at Mr. Jefferson's idea and just voted to go with the more traditional sense of these feet and pound units that we all still use today. So kind of at the very same time as the Constitution was kind of being framed and voted on and moving around, March 1791, the meter itself, which kind of was getting figured out, so to speak. The idea of it, though, was defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole, going through Paris on that arc. And in, so like 1791, 1793, they kind of came up with a good estimate. 1799, it was actually redefined by an actual artifact that would represent this length. Now, it turns out that they were off a bit. Not too surprising, given the technology that they had at the time. Basically, they thought that the Earth was spherical. It's not. It's a little off, and that caused a little bit of an error. So the talk, though, about this decimal-based system started back in 1660. So the idea was really going around for 100 and some odd years. The early versions of it kind of were working around the idea of pendulums with an established length. However, that didn't work out so well because of the differences in gravity in different places of the world. So defining a length using a pendulum, not as good as we want it to be. So this whole metric system idea kind of caught on, and a large number of countries really adopted the metric system between 1795 and 1875. And 1875 is when we had the meter convention, the first meter convention, at which 17 nations had signed this treaty of the meter and created something called the BIPM. The International Bureau of Weights and Measures. It's actually in French, so the letters are out of order for we English-speaking folk. And that governed an international system of units, and does to this day. Even though it wasn't actually called the International System of Units until 1960. It was just kind of the BIPM takes care of that and those things. The BIPM in France used to maintain certain key artifacts for calibration, and they still have one that's changing as we speak. However, over time, these have been replaced by actual experiments as opposed to physical artifacts, because physical artifacts tend to change over time. That, things shrink, things get dirty, things grow. That's the way that we've had to define some of these things has changed simply because of the way they change over time. Because if the meter shrinks, and that meter is the definition of the meter, now all the other meters have gotten too big, because the meter itself is the definition of the meter. So you can see where this would be a little problematic. So the meter itself, initially being defined as 1/10 millionth of the distance from the North Pole to the equator, turns out made a few mistakes. The Earth isn't a perfect sphere. Definition needed to be changed, so it becomes scratches in a platinum iridium bar because the measurement was wrong. Bigger problem was that these things really do change over time. So we had to come up with something else. And so today we define the meter based on the speed of light in a vacuum. That doesn't change. We've got that one down pretty solid. So if you have some light and can measure its speed accurately, you can actually do the experiment to determine a meter at its fundamental level. You don't need an artifact. All you need is to get you some light, put it in a vacuum, and see how far it goes in 1/299,792,458 of a second, and you will have a meter. That's it. Piece of cake. Should all have one in our living room. If only. So we've really come a long way since the Royal Egyptian cubit as our first real measurement standard. And here we kind of focused on length, but other things in similar manner. And while we still use feet and inches here in the U.S., and other places, for convenience and the fact that they're familiar to us, those things have even been redefined in terms of the metric system. So now even the size of your foot is determined by the speed of light in a vacuum. So, sorry Pharaoh, sorry King, you're out of it. Good enough. So just kind of some cool little history lesson on calibration, how things have evolved over time. Really fun stuff. I'm Kevin. Drop by the website. Let me know how I'm doing. www.ptguruconsulting.com. Hope to hear from you there. Drop me a note. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't. Ask a question. It's great to hear from you no matter what. I really do appreciate it. Appreciate you tuning in. Appreciate you spending some time with me. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. And I am going to talk to you on Monday. Thank you so much.